We're going to talk about relationships today. Agency or no agency, that is the question. First, the basics that you owe the public, regardless of any contractual relationship, before you do RECAD, anything. You provide services honestly and in good faith. You exercise reasonable care and skill. You keep confidential any information gained in confidence unless a disclosure is required by law or duty to a client. The information becomes public knowledge or a disclosure is authorized in writing. Present all written offers promptly to the seller and answer questions completely and accurately and, of course, honestly. What does agency really mean? It means you must be completely loyal, obedient, and faithful to the client. You have a fiduciary duty to that client, which means you work to get the best outcome for them. You are to fulfill any lawful instructions by the client that are within the scope of the transaction. Disclose all information you know that is material to the transaction that the client might not discover on their own through a reasonable investigation or observation, but do not become an expert, do not become an electrician, do not become an inspector, do not become a plumber, etc. Keep confidential any information shared by the client unless you have written permission to share it. Of course, that does not include anything unlawful or pertinent to health and safety. How do you form that relationship, that agency relationship? It is formed in a listing agreement or a buyer's agency agreement, period. It is not formed by filling out the agency disclosure in the sales contract. If you notice, this says disclosure, it does not say agreement. So this is not where that agreement is formed. Transaction broker, what does it mean? And when do you want to do it? For a buyer, you can access real estate deeds, locate properties, discuss offers, write an offer with their guidance, present offers to sellers, locate types of financing, and get the sale to the closing table. For a seller, you can assess the marketing needs and assist in preparing advertising and suggest marketing avenues such as social media, etc. You provide comps for the seller to determine pricing. You help the seller evaluate an offer, but not advocate the seller's position in accepting or rejecting any offer. In other words, you present your net sheet and let them decide if they want to accept or reject. Present an offer or counter offer to a buyer, and you, of course, get the sale to the closing table. Now, when do you want to be that? When do you want to do a transaction broker agreement? I think you want to be a transaction broker whenever the opportunity arises, because it reduces your risk, but you just have to remember not to insert yourself or talk too much. So preferably be a transaction broker for a buyer in a dual transaction rather than dual agency. Your agency relationship with your seller would of course stay intact. Now, if two parties have already negotiated a contract and the transaction, the price, everything, and all they need is paperwork, just be a transaction broker for both sides. Dual agency versus transaction broker. You can't be both. You can't be both at the same time. So you have to pick one or the other. In a dual agency situation, you cannot, without written permission, disclose to either party what the other is willing to do or pay or receive. You endeavor to be impartial, having no bias for either party. You have a fiduciary responsibility to both parties. You must be loyal to both parties. You must obey both parties. All of that is very hard to do. As a transaction broker, you can assist both buyer and seller in a transaction. You're not an agent and do not have the same obligations as an agent. You only perform the services set out in the contract. You treat each party the same, having no bias for either. And you cannot, without written permission, disclose to either party what the other is willing to do or pay or receive. They look a lot alike, but there are differences. Just a few things to think about. What if, as a transaction broker for a buyer, you find out that the seller is willing to sell a home for less? Do you have to disclose it to your buyer? Are you obligated to do that? Let's say the buyer found a house and you've given them a CMA that says the house is worth $220,000. You tell them to offer $210,000, ask for some closing costs, and let's see what happens. Is that okay? Have you overstepped your bounds? As a dual agent, what would you do if a seller asks you if you think a buyer would pay more if they countered more? You have loyalty to both parties. What would you do? If you're under contract and the seller discovers that there's a sewage plant to be built a block away, seller asks you not to tell. Do you? Should you? All good things to think about. The bottom blurry line is that the main differences between being a dual agent versus a transaction broker are that a dual agent must also provide loyalty, confidentiality, and obedience to both parties. It's very, very hard to do. That's all I have today about dual agency versus transaction broker. Please call me with any questions that you might have after watching this, and I thank you.